O Pioneers, Part 3, Chapter 1, Part 2 of Chapter 1. I keep the fire all night, Mrs. Lee. When it's very cold, I put them all on the table in the middle of the room. Other nights, I only put newspapers behind them. Frank laughs at me for fussing, but when they don't bloom, he says, "What's the matter with the darn things?" "What do you hear from Carl, Alexandra?" "He got to Dawson before the river froze, and now I suppose I won't hear any more until spring. Before he left California, he sent me a box of orange flowers, but they didn't keep very well. I have brought a bunch of Emil's letters for you." Alexandra came out from the sitting room and pinched Marie's cheek playfully. "You don't look as if the weather ever froze you up. Never have colds, do you? That's a good girl. She had dark red cheeks like this when she was a little girl, Mrs. Lee. She looked like some queer foreign kind of doll. I've never forgot the first time I saw you in Micklejohn's store, Marie, the first time Father was lying sick. Carl and I were talking about that before he went away." "I remember, and Emil had his kitten along. When are you going to send Emil's Christmas box?" "It ought to have gone before this. I'll have to send it by mail now to get it there in time." Marie pulled a dark purple silk necktie from her work basket. "I knit this for him. It's a good color, don't you think? Will you please put it in with your things and tell him it's from me to wear when he goes serenading?" Alexandra laughed. "I don't believe he goes serenading much. He says in one letter that the Mexican ladies are said to be very beautiful, but that don't seem to me very warm praise." Marie tossed her head. "Emil can't fool me. If he's bought a guitar, he goes serenading. Who wouldn't, with all those Spanish girls dropping flowers down from their windows? I'd sing to them every night, wouldn't you, Mrs. Lee?" The old lady chuckled. Her eyes lit up as Marie bent down and opened the oven door. A delicious hot fragrance blew out into the tidy kitchen. "My, something smelled good." She turned to Alexandra with a wink, her 3 yellow teeth making a brave show. "I t'ank that stop my jaw from ache no more," she said contentedly. Marie took out a pan of delicate little rolls stuffed with stewed apricots and began to dust them over with powdered sugar. "I hope you'll like these, Mrs. Lee. Alexandra does. The Bohemians always like them with their coffee. But if you don't, I have a coffee cake with nuts and poppy seeds. Alexandra, will you get the cream jug? I put it in the window to keep cool." "The Bohemians," said Alexandra as they drew up to the table, "certainly know how to make more kinds of bread than any other people in the world. Old Mrs. Hiller told me once at the church supper that she could make 7 kinds of fancy bread, but Marie could make a dozen." Mrs. Lee held up one of the apricot rolls between her brown thumb and forefinger and weighed it critically. "Just like a fedders," she pronounced with satisfaction. "My, ain't this nice?" she exclaimed as she stirred her coffee. "I used to take a little yelly now, too, I think." Alexandra and Marie laughed at her forehandedness and fell to talking of their own affairs. "I was afraid you had a cold when I talked to you over the telephone the other night, Marie. What was the matter? Had you been crying?" "Maybe I had," Marie smiled guiltily. "Frank was out late that night. Don't you get lonely sometimes in the winter when everybody has gone away?" "I thought it was something like that. If I hadn't had company, I'd have run over to see for myself. If you get downhearted, what will become of the rest of us?" Alexandra asked. "I don't very often. There's Mrs. Lee without any coffee." Later, when Mrs. Lee declared that her powers were spent, Marie and Alexandra went upstairs to look for some crochet patterns the old lady wanted to borrow. "Better put on your coat, Alexandra. It's cold up there, and I have no idea where those patterns are. I may have to look through my old trunks." Marie caught up a shawl and opened the stair door, running up the steps ahead of her guest. While I go through the bureau drawers, you might look in those hat boxes on the closet shelf over where Frank's clothes hang. There are a lot of odds and ends in them." She began tossing over the contents of the drawers, and Alexandra went into the clothes closet. Presently she came back holding a slender, elastic yellow stick in her hand. "What in the world is this, Marie? You don't mean to tell me Frank ever carried such a thing?" Marie blinked at it with astonishment and sat down on the floor. "Where did you find it? I didn't know he had kept it. I haven't seen it for years." "It really is a cane, then?" "Yes, one he brought from the old country. He used to carry it when I first knew him. Isn't it foolish? Poor Frank." Alexandra twirled the stick in her fingers and laughed. "He must have looked funny." Marie was thoughtful. "No, he didn't really. It didn't seem out of place. He used to be awfully gay like that when he was a young man. I guess people always get what's hardest for them, Alexandra." Marie gathered the shawl closer about her and still looked hard at the cane. "Frank would be all right in the right place," she said reflectively. "He ought to have a different kind of wife, for one thing. Do you know, Alexandra, I could pick out exactly the right sort of woman for Frank now. The trouble is, you almost have to marry a man before you can find out the sort of wife he needs, and usually exactly the sort you are not." "Then what are you going to do about it?" she asked candidly. Alexandra confessed she didn't know. "However," she added, "it seems to me that you get along with Frank about as well as any woman I've seen or heard of could." Marie shook her head, pursing her lips and blowing her warm breath softly out into the frosty air. "No, I was spoiled at home. I like my own way, and I have a quick tongue. When Frank brags, I say sharp things, and he never forgets. He goes over and over it in his mind. I can feel him. Then I'm too giddy. Frank's wife ought to be timid, and she ought not to care about another living thing in the world but just Frank. I didn't when I married him, but I suppose I was too young to stay like that," Marie sighed. Alexandra had never heard Marie speak so frankly about her husband before, and she felt that it was wiser not to encourage her. No good, she reasoned, ever came from talking about such things, and while Marie was thinking aloud, Alexandra had been steadily searching the hat boxes. "Aren't these the patterns, Marie?"